and welcome to the Drexel interview. I'm your host, Paula Morantz-Cohn, and today our guest is cognitive neuroscientist, Dr. John Kounios. Dr. Kounios, a professor here at Drexel University, is involved in exploring the part of the brain where sudden creative insight takes place. Dr. Kounios, welcome to the Drexel interview.
Thanks. We're happy to be here.
People have called this sudden burst of creative understanding or insight that you study the Eureka moment or the aha moment. Can you tell us a little bit about what this kind of insight is and how it differs from normal forms of thinking processes?
Well, most people have had this kind of sudden insight. It occurs when you're working on a problem, you get stuck, usually. You don't know how to proceed, you don't know what the solution is, and perhaps you've even given up for a while. And then the solution just pops into awareness, pops into consciousness, seemingly from nowhere. It could be in a dream, it could be while you're taking a shower, it could be while you're doing something completely irrelevant, but it just pops into consciousness. And this has been known about for a long time. I mean, even in ancient Greek times, there's the story of Archimedes, the mathematician. He had been, so the legend goes, he had been given a commission by King Hiero. King Hiero had bought a gold crown, and he suspected that it was mixed in with a baser metal. And he asked Archimedes to determine whether this crown was really pure gold or had something baser mixed in, but to do it without damaging the crown. So Archimedes thought about it, and one day he was going to take a bath, and he filled the tub with water. And as he stepped into the tub and saw the water level rising, he had this sudden flash of insight, and so the legend goes, he shouted Eureka and started running out of the building, running down the street without even putting his clothes on. And the solution to the problem was that any object displaces an amount of water that's equal to the volume of the object. So if he took the crown, immersed it in water, he could measure the amount of water it displaced. And then if he took the same weight of pure gold and immersed it in the tub and measured the amount of water it displaced, and if they were the same, then the crown had to be pure gold. If they were different, then it wasn't just pure gold. But that's the quintessential aha moment, or Eureka. He literally shouted Eureka, which in Greek means I found it.
Okay.
And there have been other famous incidents from legend, usually. Isaac Newton sitting under the apple tree and the apple falling in his head, and the theory of gravity occurring to him. But everybody's had, at least, usually more mundane insights about solving a problem, about interpersonal relationships, about almost anything. And usually these creative insights, they differ from normal thought in that they seem to come from nowhere. I mean, if you sit down and do an arithmetic problem, it doesn't come from nowhere. You know step by step by step how to do it. But when you have a creative insight, usually you're not totally aware or aware at all of the steps that must occur to get to that solution. And usually those go on beneath the level of awareness and then just pop into consciousness at a certain point.
Well, from the two examples that you gave, the gravity example, the apple falling, and then the bathtub example, both happen in very different contexts from where the actual problem solving would take place. There's a kind of an analogy aspect working there. Is that part of what constitutes this insight moment?
Well, it can. It doesn't have to be. Sometimes we have an insight by recognizing how a particular situation may be in a deep way similar to some other situation that we've encountered in the past. And usually that analogy, it's not obvious, so it's not immediately apparent, but something can spark it to pop into consciousness. But there are situations where it doesn't have to be analogy. I mean, there are all sorts of word problems and arithmetic problems or geometrical problems or even interpersonal problems that we might have that don't necessarily rely on tapping some past experience we've had. It's just, the idea is that these creative insights usually involve what we call remote associations between things. So we have ideas that are associated, and some of them are weakly associated. So we don't, they don't immediately pop into consciousness. But in certain situations, these distantly or remotely associated ideas can emerge into consciousness, and usually it's very suddenly. So the non-obvious becoming obvious.
Okay, and how then do you measure that? I mean, there's something to do with gamma waves, excuse me, not rays.
Okay.
We're not in science fiction here, but tell us, how do you measure gamma waves, and where do they occur? Could you tell us a little bit about that process?
Yeah. In our research, we looked, so far we've looked at a particular type of problem that involves finding these remote associates. So I'll give an example.
Okay.
We give, say, 3 words to a person, and they have to think of a 4th word that forms a compound or familiar phrase with each of the 3 words. So one example would be, the person might be given the 3 words pine, sauce, and crab. And if you take a moment to think about it, it's not obvious what word can fill the bill there. The solution to that one is apple, pineapple, crab apple, applesauce.
Okay.
And frequently, but not always, when people solve a problem like that, they have an aha moment, but not always. So what we do is we give people a series of these problems, and after they solve each one, for the ones that they do solve, they don't solve all of them, we ask them, did you have an aha or not for that particular solution? So we can separate the problems into ones that they solved, that the individuals solved with this sudden flash of insight, and ones that they didn't. And we measure brain activity while they solve these problems. So we can look separately at brain activity when they solve a problem with a flash of insight and when they solve a problem without a flash of insight, and we compare them. And we've used 2 different brain scanning techniques. This is research that I've done in collaboration with a colleague at Northwestern University, Mark Jung-Beeman. He's used functional magnetic resonance imaging, which is just MRI. A lot of people have MRI, but you can look at activity in the brain rather than just the brain structure. And I've used EEG, electroencephalogram, to look at electrical activity in the brain. My colleague Mark's brain scanning technique, the fMRI, gives you really good information about specifically where in the brain something is happening, but it's less precise about when it happens. EEG gives you not really precise information about where something's happening, but it tells you exactly when it's happening. So what we found by comparing the 2 techniques is that when people solve this kind of problem and they have a flash of insight, that it corresponds to a sudden change in electrical brain activity, high-frequency electrical brain activity, called gamma waves, and it's in the right temporal lobe, so it's just above the right ear. And the fMRI shows that that's exactly where it's happening, and the EEG shows that this happens at just the moment that the person has the idea pop into their heads, the solution. So it seems to be right hemisphere, specifically right temporal lobe, just above the right ear, at least for these kinds of verbal problems. Now, we're starting to look at other kinds of problems to do with interpreting pictures or riddles and things like that, to see whether other areas of the brain are involved in having sudden insights, but we haven't gotten to that point. So preliminarily, we don't know if this is a Eureka area of the brain or one of several possible Eureka areas of the brain.
But this is the area that shows up again and again in both of your research.
Yes.
And one is the when and the other is the where.
Right.
Okay, that's fascinating. What about the lead up to the Eureka moment? Is there any way that you can trace what's going on in this subterranean process, I guess, that leads to the Eureka moment? Are there traces of that elsewhere in the brain?
Yes. Well, that's a very good question, because in behavior research that studies how people solve these problems just from looking at their behavior, there seems to be no evidence of any answer to the solution up to the moment when it pops into their head. So the implication of that is that there's really nothing going on, and then all of a sudden it pops into the head. But we know that that's not completely accurate. The studies have been done in which stimuli have been presented to one hemisphere of the brain or the other. So for instance, if a person's looking straight ahead and you flash a stimulus on their left, that information goes first to the right hemisphere of the brain. If you present it on the right, it goes first to the left hemisphere of the brain. And by selectively presenting stimuli to the left or right hemisphere, it's been shown, particularly by my colleague Mark Jung-Beeman, that information about the correct response, about the solution to the problem, does seem to exist in the right hemisphere before you get the solution. So the solution seems to be activated, but it's weak, and it hasn't yet popped into consciousness, and it's just waiting for some event to kind of nudge it right into the threshold of awareness so that it pops into consciousness.
Yeah.
By measuring EEG, we've shown that before the solution pops into consciousness, before you have that burst of high-frequency EEG activity in the right hemisphere, there's something interesting going on in another part of the brain, in the visual part of the brain that processes visual information. And that is, for a brief moment, less than a second, the brain seems to reduce visual information going to the right hemisphere. It's almost like if I ask you a hard question, sometimes you might close your eyes or look to the side so you can focus on your own thoughts. Well, it seems as if the brain does the same thing in certain situations. It can cut off the flow of incoming information for a moment.
To concentrate in that.
To concentrate, to find that weakly activated subconscious solution, which then pops into awareness.
Wow.
And it's specifically, again, for the kinds of problems we've looked at, right hemisphere of the brain and not the left hemisphere.
Now, have you correlated this at all with, well, I guess you've given particular sorts of problems to people, but have you looked at the people themselves, the subjects of your study, in terms of the kinds of work they do, for example, or the sort of thinking they do generally, and how it might correlate with their having these moments? I can think of certain professions, for example, where this would be more common than others, and people's brains would be more attuned to that kind of thinking.
Well, we're just starting to look at that, and there is some prior research that suggests that people who have these insights, and in general, people who seem to be more creative, exactly what that means we're not yet sure,
right.
Have a different way of deploying attention. So people who tend to be creative tend to spread their attention out. They tend to be distractible. So for instance, I might find it hard to sleep if there's noise going on around, or to concentrate on something if there's a distraction going on. Whereas people who are at let's say, less creative, again, exactly what that means we're not sure, tend to focus very well and shut out distractions very well.
They're more methodical.
They're more methodical, and they're less distractible. Now, what seems to be going on is that people whose attention is spread out take in more of the environment. They take in peripheral stimuli, things going on around them. And those stimuli can trigger these unconscious concepts and boost them a little so they can pop into awareness. So you could be, say, you could have worked on a problem for a while, thought about, what do I do in this situation, and then have no idea. And then you give up for a while. Maybe you walk down the street, and your attention is all spread out, and maybe something caught your attention a little bit, maybe something in a store window or something on a magazine cover, and that's just enough to prime a weak association that will pop into consciousness. But if you're walking down the street and your attention is narrowly focused, you don't take in all those stimuli in the environment, and then they can't energize these unconscious insights.
Yeah, that's fascinating to me as a writer, and as knowing many people who are poets, for example. The whole notion of making those connections of unlike things, it seems to me that is so much part of the creative process, is to link things that you wouldn't normally think of together. And that seems to be what this notion of distractibility, that seems to be very much
Does that
what's
ring
involved.
true?
It rings true, and being scattered and just picking up stimuli and then having it help you solve a problem. That is really fascinating. Tell me something, though. When we talk about insight, we tend to think in terms of problem solving, or even, if we're thinking about writing or poetry, working out something that's somewhat intellectual. Is there any sense in which certain kinds of relational things or even emotional things can be perceived as insight? Can you have an insight that you hate someone, for example?